Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm hoping you can see my screen and hear me.
Yep, all good. I can see Loyalty Day 21 with a bear and you in the corner.
There you go. So thanks for that introduction. Today, as you say, I'm not going to be talking about all the great things from Salesforce.org that we do to support charities, but instead I'm going to reflect on my 20 years experience in the commercial sector in loyalty roles. I thought I'd start by mentioning a few charities close to my heart and showing a couple of pictures that perhaps reflect the real me. I'm a keen runner, and at the start of this COVID year, I set myself the challenge to run a half marathon every month. And so far, I'm on track with 11 down. The other photo is of me, of my team at Earlywood Scout Campsite, where I'm the chairperson. And I deliberately changed the name to Chair from Chairman after my eldest daughter, who's 8, mentioned to me that she wanted to run the site one day, but was sad that she couldn't do it as the title was Chairman. So that's just a bit about me and to introduce myself. Some of the charities that I've run for, Tusk, Dementia Revolution, spent time out in Ghana with Rally International, and then Special Olympics is close to my heart, and scouting. So I started my career at dunhumby, the now legendary CRM data agency that Tesco bought in 2002 to help them become a customer-led organisation. And one of the founders, Clive Humby, is actually credited with coining the term, data is the new oil. And he said this back in 2006, which was pretty early on. Now, this book here, Scoring Points, is a brilliant book that I'd recommend if you are interested in that kind of journey that Tesco's went on to use data to make better decisions. And I'm not just saying that as I'm credited at the back of the book, but it really does tell you some of those experiences and tell you a bit about how Tesco's transformed the way they operated. Thinking back to my kind of Waitrose time, this was their very early loyalty scheme. And if anybody has a copy of a card that looks like this, you're actually in a very small, unique group of people. Because this card that they launched, they actually soon found out was actually illegal, as it has the royal crescents on it, which actually break the rules around how you can use them. So if you do have one of those, you can count yourself lucky and probably a very early and loyal shopper to Waitrose. Anyway, I think one of the things that I'd reflect on for loyalty is around, challenging the concepts and the perceived answers and best practice. And when Waitrose launched their loyalty scheme, they kind of said, actually, we don't want a point scheme. We can't really afford a point scheme. So let's try and do things differently. And, when I then think about the charity sector and the non-profit sector that I now work in, loyalty is an absolutely fascinating concept that we can absolutely apply to the non-profit world. But actually having the burden and the costs associated with running a loyalty scheme and having, points and things like that is potentially an avenue that you might not want to go down. And what I've always learned, and more recently when I was working across Waitrose and John Lewis, we were looking at what the future of loyalty might be. And the two topics that just came up time and time again when we thought about loyalty was balancing the emotional side of loyalty and the rational side of loyalty. And I think, many good loyalty schemes have really got the rational side ticked off, that you get points for each transaction, that you get, after you've done 5 of something, you get a reward. When you do something twice, you get a benefit. But actually it's the emotional side that is much harder, and more loyalty schemes are struggling with how they kind of crack having that emotional side of loyalty. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for the non-profit sector. When John Lewis look and think about what benefits they can give back to customers, actually some of the benefits that don't really cost them anything had the biggest reaction from their customers. And if you cast your mind back in the last couple of weeks, I suspect many of you, like me, have been quite excited about the kind of Super Bowl moment of the UK when the John Lewis Christmas advert is released. And actually that created quite a good opportunity where all the branches for John Lewis could invite their best customers in to come and watch the new John Lewis advert the night before it was released. And, you know, they literally went into the store in the evening, were met by the branch manager and went to the kind of staff canteen and watched the advert. It literally cost the store hardly anything. But those customers that went there felt like gold dust. You know, they had bragging rights. They could, you know, at all the Christmas parties that year, they could say, well, I saw the Christmas advert before anybody else. And it's thinking to what opportunities you have or could create that have that really high perceived value and, you know, have high emotional reaction to them versus the kind of rational points or benefits that you can give out that, you know, customers might not remember, and it's finding the kind of the partnership between the two, emotional and rational loyalty. Next up, I want to kind of think about, well, not necessarily watercress, but, you know, does anybody recognize this product? And more than that, will anybody admit to having purchased it? It is a few years ago now, so the packaging may have been tweaked a bit. However, the fascinating thing that Waitrose discovered about this product, that it was almost exclusively bought by their very, very best customers. And just think about that for a moment. You know, typically the store manager or partners in store, they don't know who the best customers are. And perhaps at some of your events, you know, you don't necessarily know who the best customers are when you're walking around, and who are the most loyal people. But actually, you know, if any customer went in and picked up this product, it was a very easy way for them to identify that they're best customers. And, you know, retailers have admittedly very sophisticated CRM and data capabilities at their fingertips. And one of my favorite exercises to do with all that data was to look at the kind of path to best and explore any common ground in customers and how they became a best customer. And, you know, do they typically start by opening emails? Do they buy in certain areas? Have they participated in events? Are there certain products that they buy and they shop these categories and then this category next? And actually, I think that path to best and the understanding of that could cross over into the non-profit sector. You know, are there early indicators of best customers that could perhaps be nurtured to ensure that they are supporters and that they're on that path to best and they're not missed, and that, you know, opportunities happen. A final thought on the watercress, you know, when the vegetable buyer is reviewing their product range, if they only looked at sales data, they might delist and stop selling watercress. And actually for Waitrose, this could mean losing the best customers, that, you know, their whole business, their whole shop, because that watercress is really important for them. So again, it's about understanding, you know, using that data to understand who your best customers are, how they shop, and how they become a best customer. Another topic that I've always been really passionate about in the CRM is there's lots of excitement about the digital world, but actually I think it's about doing what's right for your customers or donors or supporters. And many people are surprised at you know, the response that retailers get from the kind of lower tech CRM capabilities. And I certainly found in my experience that direct mail is not dead, and that, you know, the retailers are making hundreds of millions of pounds of incremental sales by sending out mailings to customers. And even things like this rather naff looking kind of till receipt that Waitrose and many other retailers in the UK use, it's incredibly targeted, getting it into the hands of the customer and using it in a very sophisticated way. And, you know, that's a challenge to think how could that be used in the non-profit sector. And we also found that millennials are loving direct mail. You know, we had such a high cut through them because they received so little direct mail. They didn't give out their addresses very often, that when they got the direct mail, they you know, their minds were blown. And so we used that very effectively and actually, you know, exploited probably a strong word, explored and used that to our best ability. The next story I wanted to kind of just dwell on was about, you know, as a marketeer, sometimes, you know, good or even great ideas actually don't turn out as you'd like them. Some of you may remember from Waitrose the pick your own offers. And at the time it was a world's first. And I think one of the journalists said it was game changing for the retail industry. And it was a great idea. but it was the impact of the idea of, you know, the idea versus the reality, and also about measurement. And it was a challenge for us. So at first, when we measured the impact, it did brilliantly. And this concept was a simple concept that customers could choose, admittedly from a list, of which offers they wanted to have. And they could select up to 10 offers and get 25% off those products. Sounds brilliant. However, it was just too complicated. I think what Waitrose expected customers to do, and all the hoops they were expected to jump through, their customers just didn't want to do that. And it was just, you know, we were expecting too much of them. And many customers, you know, although they liked the idea, the reality was just too difficult. You know, they might have selected a specific type of ham or a box of shreddies when they selected their offers. However, when they went to the branch, to the store to go and buy that, they couldn't remember, was it the big box of shreddies or the small box of shreddies? And then worse, they were then frustrated that they weren't getting the discount on the product that they'd chosen. So it was just too complicated. Another one on the Waitrose world is, you know, sometimes research and analytics doesn't necessarily tell you the answer. So, you know, we did a lot of research before the free coffee was launched, and customers were overriding saying they didn't want a free drink in a supermarket. They wouldn't support that. However, if you then dig into that research and really try to understand the customers, you can actually see that which customers are saying that, and is it that they haven't thought it through and that they don't really realize what you're offering them. And the free coffee went on to become, you know, they were giving out about 52 million cups of coffee a week. So from a group of people who said they didn't want something to a very large group of people using it. You then roll on, and actually, the other thing I'd say is, when opportunities arise and you have the chance to do the right thing, that can be really powerful. And this happened a couple of Christmases ago when Sir David Attenborough launched the kind of Blue Planet, and the whole message around plastic and environmental damage was so big that Waitrose had a kind of golden moment where they had to listen to their customers and take action, and actually removing the coffee as such by saying you could only have it if you had your own cup. It was a very bold decision, but the right one that they followed through on, and the way they positioned it to their customers, no customer could complain or challenge that Waitrose were doing the right thing for the environment. And actually there might have been a little bit of a cost saving there on the back of that as well. We mentioned rational loyalty earlier, and I think, you know, thinking around how you can lock your donors and supporters and meet their rational needs, and, you know, remind them, reassure them, explain how much good value they're getting. And we always had a lot of success, and a lot of retailers and other companies now do it with that kind of value statement, playing back your donations, playing back what you're doing, playing back the amount of reward they've got, playing back how much your money has gone and worked. And that really helps those customers rationalize what they're doing. But I was just going to end by saying, you know, as well as doing that rational side, it's really important to make sure you have that emotional side there as well, and thinking through to your, you know, supporters and donors, how you can make their lives easier, give them bragging rights, helping them to learn and become better, or connect with other people. All of those were really important things that John Lewis and Waitrose saw, so that they could tap into that kind of more emotional side of loyalty. And that's certainly what saw a lot of success for the retailer in what they're doing. And kind of connected to that is why Waitrose and John Lewis realized they had this opportunity around the circular economy. And this was a scheme that was launched, sadly, just before COVID, and COVID has kind of slowed things down quite a lot. But this was the great idea of buying back customers' clothing. And this was, you know, through a load of research and listening to different customer needs, customers, you know, had loads of clothing, and they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't really understand, should it, when should it go back to the charity shops? When should it, when do I just recycle it? And actually, is there an opportunity that John Lewis kind of jumped at, whereby some of the clothing still has a really high value in it, may not have been used very much, and actually by buying it back and giving customers a real value, the customer would come back into John Lewis and shop again. And again, this was initially trialed, and again, I think I would say that with any of these loyalty initiatives, try them. Don't get hung up on having the solution being perfect. So getting to that minimum viable product, or even a minimum marketable product as quickly as you can, so that you can test something and actually see how do customers react. And when we tested buyback in the Oxford branch of John Lewis, we very quickly realized that some of the preconceptions we've got on what customers wanted and how they'd use it was very different. Customers wanted it at all tills. They didn't want to just go to one place. They didn't want to just put their old used clothes into a box or a bin. And actually, it was really important that the clothes were received in a kind of premium way and thanked for them and folded up neatly, and then your gift voucher was given across. And that was some of those lessons were only learned from trial and error, and seeing what's the optimum value that you give back to customers, how should it be delivered, and that's where we learned so much. And I think the not-for-profit sector absolutely can do the same, again, perhaps with slightly fewer people, so that might be more challenging, but we had a very small team who were very agile, and we were given huge power to go and test and learn. And that's the great thing, that if you can get the data behind it, and if you can isolate to a couple of stores, you can certainly see the impact really quickly, and then with that you can then do some calculations to see what it might look like if you roll it out further. And measurement is really hard, and I know that that's one of the themes that has been talked about today. And in loyalty, it's no different. When I was at Tesco back in the early 2000s, I remember they hired a nuclear submarine rocket scientist who spent about 6 months and pretty much failed to measure the benefits of Tesco Clubcard. And that was because Clubcard had become synonymous with Tesco's. It was very hard to isolate what was the impact of Tesco versus what was the impact of Clubcard. Things have moved on, and it has become easier. But Sky talked about their VIP loyalty scheme, and they failed to measure anything for the first 12 months. So don't be downhearted. It can be measured, but it isn't necessarily easy. And keeping things small, keeping things simple, and setting things up, and being really clear at the outset, because that's sometimes the reason these things fail, of how you're going to measure them. So the importance of things like control groups is really important. So to kind of conclude, the last thing I want to throw out there from my observations was around subscriptions. And I know we're kind of just saying loyalty is interesting, but I also think, a step beyond that, kind of loyalty and subscriptions, that's something that has really set fire to some of the retailers out there in that sector. And this is one of my favorite retail loyalty subscriptions, Loblaws from Canada. I don't know about you, but I've got about 23 subscriptions when I kind of think about it and go through them all. And I will admit, some of them I don't actually pay for. So I do share certain subscriptions with different people, family or friends, or even my parents. My dad still pays for which subscription, which I do use his login. And I think that's an interesting one as a kind of mix up, just to think through what's the kind of future for loyalty. And nobody's really done it that much in the not-for-profit sector, but is there an appetite perhaps for paying some kind of subscription, or the monthly donations already happens, but by committing in that way, are there additional loyalty benefits you might get, and what might that mean to customers? So I'm conscious, I think I've talked for about 20 minutes, so I was going to pause there and hand back over to Richard to see if there are any comments, questions, or anything else.
Oh, thank you so much, Sam. That's like lots of questions, lots of thoughts, lots of things going on there. So I think, oh yes, lots of questions. Right, where do we start? So I think this is a really good question. So retail has a lot of data. Charities don't tend to have so much. Do you think charities should be striving to capture more data? And if so, do you have ideas on how they might do that?
So I guess the straightforward answer is yes. You know, data is really powerful, but at the same time, there's probably some data you don't need or don't want. So I would always ask the question and perhaps think through and do a bit of an exercise around, if I had this data, what would I do with it? There'll always be some data you won't realize what you could be doing with it until you have it. But, you know, before you go out and get lots of data, you could spend some time with your teams and stuff going, you know, what different would we do if we had a year's worth of this data? What might we be able to do with it? What decisions could we make differently? What reports could we run? What dashboards would we have? And how would we use that insight to drive, you know, more fundraising or better understanding or create better experiences or events for our donors or supporters?
Thank you. So there's been a few themes through today, and I think Roger talked earlier about his loyalty to Reading Football Club. I just love bringing that up. And actually, loyalty is not necessarily the things you do. It's not transactional. It's not behavioural. It's not the stuff and it's a little bit like you're talking about the point scheme. So you get points for doing 5 things or one thing 5 times and that kind of thing. But actually, one of the ways we look at loyalty is much more in terms of the emotional side. And you talked about the rational side and the emotional side. One of the things Roger talked about was the 3 drivers of loyalty for a charity support, which is, you know, the 3 most important emotions are commitment, which is having a passion for the cause, it's satisfaction, the relationship's a good one, and trust. You fundamentally trust, you know, that the organisation is going to spend your money in the right way, make the right decisions. So there's 3 things: there's commitment, satisfaction, and trust. There are 3 sort of emotions that have come out of the research that drives charity support or loyalty. I wondered, from your years of experience in the retail sector, are there emotions that stand out that are indicative or predictive of a customer's future value at a retailer?
That's a good question. I think for their indicative future value, I mean, it's probably more behavioural. It probably goes to be, you would look first at more the rational behaviour rather than the emotional behaviour is much harder to kind of measure and really get to the bottom of. Whereas the rational behaviour is much easier and quicker to kind of track. And as you mentioned, in retail, you do have a lot of data in that area. Yeah, I mean, net promoter score is always one of the top things that retailers use to possibly get some more of that emotional thoughts. You know, would you recommend John Lewis to your friends and family? That's a very helpful kind of check-in to see, do they really, you know, believe in you and think you're a great place? The downside of that is that doesn't necessarily mean they shop with you. So you could have somebody that gives you an incredible net promoter score and thinks the John Lewis brand is brilliant, but they may only shop with you once a year for a very small purchase because they know that Auntie Lucy loves John Lewis. They still love the brand, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're spending with you. And, you know, when I think of my relationship with some charities, I would have a very high emotional attachment to them and relationship with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm giving to them today or donating to them today, but I might still describe myself as being really connected to them and a believer in that charity.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Right, if I just come in on that?
Yeah, of course you may.
Just because it ties in so much with something that came up earlier on about the conversation about lapsed supporters, and just the conversation. I think it was David put in the chat saying he feels very loyal to British Heart Foundation, but the British Heart Foundation would think he's a really rubbish supporter.
Yeah.
And that it's such an important point to draw out. I think that difference between the rational and the irrational, if we're sort of slightly oversimplifying it in that way.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, I remember I did a lot of focus groups with Waitrose and John Lewis, and you know, the data would tell you these were loyal Waitrose shoppers, and they'd be recruited to come to a focus group because of that. But they didn't know, they wouldn't have thought of themselves as loyal shoppers. So sometimes it can go both ways. Sometimes, you know, you have these people in the room, you've recruited them, you know their spend, they are high spenders, but they don't know. And then there's the other ones where they consider themselves incredibly loyal to your brand and totally believe in them, huge advocates, but they only need to shop that brand once every 2 years or 3 years for a small thing or something, but they still believe and are really connected to you.
It's interesting you talking about net promoter. I mean, Roger and I, you know, not with each other, but we lock horns with the concept of net promoter over charities, because people give to charity for many personal reasons and motivations, and rarely because somebody says, "Oh, I recommend you give to that charity." So, yeah. So but there are circumstances, and there are. Yeah, thank you, David. So distracted me with messages in the chat, David. Also about net promoter score. And so yes, there are times when it can work. So if you had a really good, so if you've run a half marathon, if you run a half marathon every month and you did that for a charity, and the experience that charity gave you was fantastic, you might say to a friend, if you're running a half marathon for a charity, run it for this charity, because actually I got the best experience. I felt like I was changing the world. So in some circumstances, that net promoter score can work really well. But this is a very long-winded way of saying that when we do our loyalty research, we do ask a kind of a slightly amended question relating to net promoter score, and we found that actually growing loyalty, growing sort of that the strength of the emotional relationship, growing commitment, satisfaction, and trust, can have a massive impact on someone's likelihood to promote. And I think that plays to Roger, what you're saying about David's experience at British Heart Foundation, Sam, you're talking about like loyal customers who aren't maybe spending, but actually their value as a channel, as a route to market, as a communicator, as an advocate, as an evangelist for the brand, for the charity, can be immensely powerful. So I think it's one of those things to say that Roger and I, we kind of love it and hate it all at the same time, because it really can't work in some respects, but actually there's some real value in there. And I think by asking people about their propensity or likelihood of recommending does reflect their underlying feelings about the charity, not necessarily that they're going to go out and absolutely make a recommendation, but it does have a reflection. And we've seen the correlation very strongly with loyalty, so we have the evidence. Oh gosh, almost running out of time. I think I had one more question. Or is it two? I can probably squeeze it into one. I was really interested about the pre-screening of the Christmas ad. How did you define best customers, and what did you do with them afterwards? So let's have it as one question. It's like, how do you define the people you invite to that event, and then what's the kind of next stages in their journey?
Yeah, good question. I guess I've always had it brainwashed into me around, you know, recency, frequency, and value. Something around those three is a very helpful proxy. So, you know, how often, and again, retail is slightly different, but, you know, how often are they visiting and how much are they spending on those visits? And then overlaying something around that recency, because if they haven't shopped for, say, 3 months, particularly in food sector, then they're not a best customer for you. John Lewis do it slightly differently, because, you know, you may come into John Lewis and buy a whole kitchen for, say, 15 grand, but you might only do that every 3 years. So they do need to be balanced around a little bit. They also look at a kind of pan partnership view. So you might be very valuable for Waitrose and have a small value for John Lewis, but overall you've got a really big value. And again, Tesco's found a similar thing around the more parts of the Tesco business you shop, the more value you have. So if you're a Tesco Mobile, Tesco Personal Finance, you shop online, you shop in store, all of those things would tip you higher up the best value chain. And then the second part of the question was, what did they do with them? And they literally bought some cheap bubbles and had some crisps and nibbles. So they actually went into the staff canteen area. It was very low tech, but these people who came just thought it was incredible. They were going behind the scenes of John Lewis, and they could see, you know, where the staff go, and that was an out of bounds area normally. and they literally watched the advert on the staff canteen TV, and then hung around with a few of the staff and the branch manager, who said a few words afterwards. But it was a very special moment for them, and the branch manager loved it, because, you know, if Richard only ever shops online, then the branch manager might not realise that Richard is a best customer, because he only sees him come in and spend £1, and, you know, he comes in and goes. Whereas now suddenly the branch manager's got sight of the 20, 30 of their best customers. And then the final part of that would be, you always have to invite far more people than you get, because not everybody will accept it.